There is a city that is disappearing. Not metaphorically, literally. Every year it sinks a few centimeters further into the ground. The northern districts have already dropped 2.5 meters over the past few decades. By 2050, nearly half the city could sit below sea level. That city is Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, the largest urban area on the planet, home to 42 million people. A megacity built over 3.5 centuries, and one that is now slowly, unstoppably sinking into the sea. Indonesia has made a decision that no country in modern history has made at this scale. It is abandoning its capital, building a new one from scratch in the jungle of the island of Borneo, 1,000 kilometers from Jakarta, in a place where, just a few years ago, there was nothing but trees and rivers. But here's what makes this story genuinely gripping. Behind the colossal engineering project lies a story that began long before the first excavator rolled into the Bornean jungle. A story about a city built somewhere it should never have been built. About land that sent warnings that nobody listened to. And about a new capital that risks repeating the fate of the one everyone is fleeing. Stay with this to the end. The final turn is one nobody saw coming. To understand why Jakarta is sinking, you need to understand what it's standing on. When Dutch colonists established a trading port here in the early 17th century and named it Batavia, the local population had long understood something important about this place. 13 rivers drain into the sea here. The ground itself is centuries of river sediment, soft, waterlogged, unstable soil that was always closer to a swamp than solid earth. The Dutch built canals, modeling the city on Amsterdam. They believed they were turning a swamp into a civilized city. What they were actually doing was building on material that was never designed to support heavy structures. While the population was small and the buildings were light, it held. Then the city started to grow. Then to explode. By the end of the 20th century, Jakarta had become one of the largest cities on Earth. Millions of people, millions of buildings, endless layers of asphalt and concrete, all pressing down on soft ground. And the ground began to give way. But that was only half the problem. The other half was water. Jakarta has always suffered from a shortage of clean water through its centralized supply system. Residents and businesses began pumping water from underground aquifers, millions of wells across the entire city. When water is extracted from underground, the soil above the voids subsides. This is exactly what had been happening in Jakarta for decades, on top of the weight of the city above. The result? The north of the city has dropped 2.5 meters. Some areas continue to sink by 25 centimeters a year. That is one of the fastest rates of ground subsidence anywhere in the world. To put it another way, parts of Jakarta are sinking at roughly the same pace as your fingernails grow. In northern Jakarta, entire neighborhoods reached the point long ago where water is simply part of daily life. Muara Baru is one of the oldest coastal districts in the city. Here stand houses whose ground floors have long since gone underwater. Residents live on the second and third floors. They move through the streets by boat. Electrical cables hang above the waterline, at the level where the roof of a single-story building once was. This is not the aftermath of a flood. This is the permanent condition. The water doesn't go anywhere, because there is nowhere for it to go. The land has dropped below sea level. The sea walls that are supposed to protect the shore are themselves beginning to subside, along with the ground. The Dutch colonial legacy here reads with bitter irony. The Dutch, a nation that spent centuries reclaiming land from the sea, built a city that the sea is now reclaiming from them. The canal system they constructed as a defense against water has itself become part of the flooded landscape. The old Dutch Fort Batavia, one of the few surviving architectural monuments from the colonial era, stands today surrounded by tourist cafes and souvenir stalls. But compare a 17th century map with a modern one, and you can see how the coastline has shifted. The sea has moved closer, the land has dropped. The fort that was built on the waterfront now stands several kilometers from the water. But the water is coming anyway. In 2019, Indonesian President Joko Widodo announced a decision that left urban planners around the world holding their breath. Indonesia is moving its capital, not to a neighboring city, not to another district, to a different island. 1,000 kilometers away, into the jungles of Borneo, where there are no roads, no infrastructure, and no cities of any meaningful size. The new capital was given the name Nusantara, an ancient word from the language of Javanese poetry, meaning roughly archipelago or islands in between. The word was used to describe the Indonesian world in medieval texts as far back as the 14th century, long before the nation of Indonesia itself existed. The choice of name was a conscious symbolic statement. Nusantara is not just a new city. It is a declaration about what Indonesia wants to be. A country rooted in its own history but facing forward. The site chosen for the new capital is in the province of East Kalimantan on Borneo. The reasoning was straightforward. Borneo is one of the most geologically stable islands in the archipelago. No volcanoes, minimal earthquake risk, none of the catastrophic ground subsidence that is consuming Jakarta. But there was something the official presentations mentioned only quietly. The site chosen for Nusantara is not empty space. It is living Bornean jungle. One of the last large tracts of tropical rainforest remaining on the planet. Home to orangutans, proboscis monkeys, and hundreds of species of birds, many of which exist nowhere else on Earth. When construction crews began clearing the site, environmental groups raised the alarm. Around Balikpapan Bay, near which Nusantara is being built, lie mangrove forests that serve as one of the most important marine nurseries for the entire regional ecosystem. The start of construction has already affected parts of those forests. But here's something extraordinary that barely registers outside Indonesia. On the land designated for the new capital, there are indigenous communities whose ancestors lived in these forests long before any Indonesian state existed. Their villages, their traditional lands, their sacred sites, all of it fell inside the perimeter of the new megaproject. The government held consultations, paid compensation, but the question of how centuries-old land rights weigh against a government decision to build a capital city turned out to be far more complicated than Nusantara's architects had anticipated. The Bajau people, sea nomads who for centuries have lived on boats and stilted homes above the water of Balikpapan Bay, watched the construction of the new capital with a particular feeling. They understood better than anyone what it meant to live between land and water, and they knew that the jungle the bulldozers were clearing was alive in the truest sense, not metaphorically, but literally. In October 2024, Indonesia got a new president. Prabowo Subianto inherited the Nusantara project as a political obligation, not as a personal passion. The early signals were sobering. Funding for 2025 was cut roughly in half. Plans for 2026 were scaled back further still. The new president didn't make his first visit to the construction site until more than a year after taking office. International headlines began appearing. Nusantara risks becoming a ghost city. People who had relocated to the new capital in hopes of stable government work described the same sensation reported by residents of Forest City in Malaysia. Beautiful buildings, wide roads, and almost nobody around. One visitor from the island of Sulawesi described Nusantara like this. It's like Singapore, clean, modern, and strangely quiet. Almost no one here. But officials insist the project is continuing. The legislative and judicial buildings are due to be completed in 2026. The president plans to relocate to Nusantara in 2028. More than 4,000 government workers are expected to transfer there within the coming year. Only one question remains. Will anyone actually follow? And here is the central paradox that nobody predicted. While Nusantara is being built, Jakarta is going nowhere, and has no intention of going anywhere. 42 million people are not moving to the jungles of Borneo. The economy, the factories, the ports, the universities, the cultural life, all of it stays in Jakarta. The new president even officially downgraded Nusantara's designation from national capital to simply political capital. Jakarta will retain its status as the country's economic and cultural center, which means Indonesia is no longer building a replacement for Jakarta. It is building a parallel administrative center, expensive, remote, slowly filling with bureaucrats, while the actual life of the country continues in a sinking city on the western coast of Java. And Jakarta itself, despite everything, keeps living. New skyscrapers go up, a metro system gets built out, sea walls go in. The city fights the water the way it always has, stubbornly, loudly, ignoring the projections. Because 42 million people is not a number. It is lives, habits, families, the graves of grandparents, favorite street food stalls and night markets. It is a story that cannot be relocated to another island by government decree. Jakarta is sinking. That is a fact neither scientists nor the Indonesian government disputes. Nusantara is being built, slower than promised, quieter than planned, but built. And between those two realities sits a question humanity has not yet answered. What do you do with a city that cannot be saved and cannot be abandoned? What do you do with millions of people whose lives are woven so deeply into the fabric of a place that is slowly going underwater? The Dutch, who founded Batavia on a swamp 400 years ago, believed they had conquered nature. They dug canals, drained marshes, built forts and warehouses. Nature waited, patiently. And now it is taking back what it was owed, centimeter by centimeter, year by year. In the jungles of Borneo, white government buildings are rising from the new capital, clean, modern, nearly empty. At their foundations, rivers run, the same rivers that flowed here long before any capital existed and will flow long after every one of them is gone. Nusantara is waiting for people. Jakarta is waiting for water. And while both of those waits continue, the story of Indonesia is being written in two places at once.